The first collision. The morning sunlight reflected off the cracked asphalt outside the Rolling Biscuit Diner, a small establishment nestled in a suburban neighborhood that rarely made the news. For most, it was a sanctuary of routine, a place for coffee refills, friendly smiles, and the occasional heated debate about sports. But today, it would become the epicenter of an unfolding tragedy. Robert King, a retired Army sergeant in his late 50s, stood at the counter, his broad shoulders squared and his stance commanding despite the wear of time. His military jacket was worn but immaculate, every metal polished to a gleaming shine. He was a man who carried himself with quiet dignity, someone whose very presence commanded respect without demanding it. "Morning, Mr. King." Mary, the diner's longtime waitress, greeted warmly as she slid his to-go order of pancakes and coffee across the counter. Robert nodded and gave a small smile. "Morning, Mary. You're looking bright as ever." She chuckled. "Flattery'll get you nowhere, Sergeant." The door jingled behind him, and Robert turned to leave, but his steps faltered as he caught sight of two young men being approached by a police officer just outside the diner's large front window. Something in the way the officer moved, quick, aggressive, his hand already resting on his belt, made Robert pause. The young men, no older than their early 20s, stood frozen, their postures defensive but not confrontational. They carried reusable grocery bags and wore the kind of weary expressions that came from knowing they were guilty of nothing but might still lose everything. Robert exhaled slowly. His instincts screamed at him to stay out of it, to mind his own business. He had lived long enough to know the cost of stepping in. But something deep within him, a sense of duty he could never shake, propelled him forward. As he pushed open the diner door, the sound of the officer's raised voice met him. "What's in the bag? Got something you shouldn't, huh?" The officer demanded, yanking one of the bags from the taller young man's grip. "It's just groceries, sir," the young man stammered, his voice shaking. The officer, Bradley Price, rifled through the bag with exaggerated motions, his face twisting into a sneer as he pulled out a bottle of unmarked pills. "Groceries, huh? What's this then? Drugs?" Bradley's voice carried, loud enough for a small crowd to gather. People trickled out of the diner and nearby shops, their phones raised to record. "They're vitamins," the shorter of the two young men said, his voice barely audible. "For my mom." Robert stepped forward. "Officer, is there a problem?" Bradley turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Robert. "Stay out of this, old man. I don't need a lecture." Robert didn't flinch. "I'm not lecturing. I'm asking if there's a reason to treat these boys like criminals when they haven't done anything wrong." Bradley's jaw clenched. His hand hovered dangerously close to his holstered weapon. "Who do you think you are?" "Robert King," he said, extending a hand that Bradley ignored. "Retired Army sergeant. I spent my life serving this country, and I've seen men like you before." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Phones tilted to get better angles as the confrontation escalated. Bradley stepped closer, his voice low but seething. "You think that uniform makes you special. You don't know me, and you don't know these boys," Robert replied calmly. "But you're treating them like threats. That's not law enforcement. That's bullying." The younger man whispered, "Please, sir, don't." Robert raised a hand to silence him, keeping his focus on Bradley. "You can still walk away from this, officer. No harm done." But Bradley had no intention of backing down. His insecurities and temper, fueled by the eyes of the crowd and Robert's unflinching composure, pushed him past the point of reason. "Step back," Bradley barked, shoving Robert's chest with both hands. Robert didn't budge. "I said no." The tension snapped like a frayed wire. Bradley's fist lashed out, striking Robert square in the jaw. The crowd gasped in unison as Robert staggered but refused to fall. His metals glinted in the sunlight before he collapsed, his head hitting the pavement with a sickening crack. "Dad!" A voice shouted from the edge of the crowd. A teenage boy with wide, Panicked eyes pushed through the onlookers, his phone clenched in one trembling hand. He knelt beside Robert, his face twisting with a mix of fear and fury. "Step back," Bradley yelled, his face red as he waved a threatening hand at the growing crowd. "Get him in cuffs." But the boy didn't move. Instead, he raised his phone higher, capturing every second of his father's still body, the trickle of blood staining the cracks in the sidewalk, and the chaos Bradley had unleashed. As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, the boy's eyes locked onto Bradley's. His expression hardened, no longer just a look of shock but a promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The rising storm. The hospital's waiting room buzzed with muted tension. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the rows of plastic chairs. Jamal King sat hunched over, his phone gripped tightly in one hand, the other clenched into a trembling fist on his lap. His heart raced as he replayed the video on his phone. The moment Officer Bradley Price struck his father, Robert King, and sent him crumpling to the ground. The world had seen it too. Within hours of the incident, the video had gone viral, its raw footage igniting outrage across social media. The hashtags were relentless. Hashtag Justice for Robert King, hashtag Stop Police Brutality, and hashtag Heranathreat trended nationally. Strangers poured out their shock, anger, and disbelief in the comments. But for Jamal, this wasn't just a hashtag. This was his father, a man who had shielded him from harm his whole life, now lying unconscious behind the heavy double doors of the ICU. Jamal. A soft voice broke his focus. He looked up to see his mother, Evelyn King, her face pale and drawn. She'd flown in from the other side of the country the moment she heard the news. Though she and Robert had been divorced for years, the bond of shared history tied her to this moment. "How is he?" Jamal asked, his voice hoarse. Evelyn shook her head, blinking back tears. "The doctors, they don't know. They say we have to wait." Her voice cracked, and she gripped Jamal's hand. "Your father's strong, Jamal. He's fought through worse." Jamal nodded, but the words offered little comfort. He had grown up hearing stories of his father's resilience, how he had survived ambushes in war zones, carried wounded comrades to safety under fire, and led missions that had changed the course of lives. Yet here he was, reduced to fragility by a single act of senseless violence. The doors to the ICU swung open, and a man in a suit entered the waiting room. His broad shoulders and firm stride gave him the aura of authority. He stopped when he saw Jamal and Evelyn. "Jamal King?" the man asked. Jamal stood cautiously. "Who's asking?" "Colonel Anthony Myers," the man said, extending a hand. "I served with your father." Jamal blinked in surprise, then shook the colonel's hand. "You knew him in the army?" Myers nodded solemnly. "Your father and I were on the same unit during the Gulf War." "He's not just a soldier, Jamal. Your father is a legend." Evelyn looked up, startled. "A legend?" "Robert King isn't just any veteran," Myers said, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. "He led missions that saved hundreds of lives. Some of them are classified, but the people who know, those who served with him, we owe him everything." Jamal felt a surge of pride mixed with anger. Then why didn't anyone protect him? He gave everything for this country, and now look where he is. Myers' expression darkened. "What happened to your father is an outrage, but I came here for another reason. I want you to know you're not alone in this fight. There are people who will stand by you, people who owe their lives to your father. We won't let this go unanswered." Jamal's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see another flood of notifications. Strangers from across the world were commenting on the video, calling for justice, sharing stories of Robert King's service. For the first time, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope that this wasn't just another tragedy to be buried under headlines. This was personal, for him, for his family, and now for everyone who had seen the video. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley Price sat in his car in the parking lot of the precinct, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had seen the video too, watched it on loop as his name became a rallying cry for public outrage. His colleagues avoided him, their usual camaraderie replaced with cold indifference. Even his partner, Officer Daniels, had stopped returning his texts. Bradley's phone buzzed. He hesitated before picking it up, knowing full well it wouldn't be good news. Sure enough, the notification was another news article. Who is Robert King? The hero America failed. His stomach churned as he scrolled through the article, detailing Robert's decorated military career and the horrific contrast of his treatment at the hands of law enforcement. A knock on his car window startled him. He looked up to see Captain Melissa Ward, her sharp features drawn with irritation. "Price, get inside," she barked. "Now." Bradley opened the door and stepped out, following her into the precinct. The usual hum of the station seemed quieter, the weight of tension palpable. He could feel the stares of his fellow officers as he walked past. In the briefing room, Captain Ward closed the door and turned to him, arms crossed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, her voice low but seething. Bradley tried to defend himself. He was interfering with an investigation. "Don't," Ward snapped, cutting him off. "I'd watched the video, Price. Everyone has. That wasn't an investigation. It was an assault. And now, the whole world is watching." Bradley swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" "What you should have done from the start. Own up to your actions. Internal affairs is already breathing down our necks, and it's only a matter of time before they make their move." Bradley clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. But he knew she was right. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Back at the hospital, Jimmel stood outside, staring at the growing crowd of protesters. Signs reading "Justice for King" and "Stop Police Violence" bobbed above the crowd. Chants filled the air, a mixture of outrage and solidarity. News vans lined the street, their reporters eagerly capturing the scene. Evelyn joined him, her expression conflicted. "I never thought I'd see this," she said softly. Jimmel turned to her. "Neither did I. But if Dad was here, he'd want us to fight. He'd want us to stand up for what's right." Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just promise me you'll be careful. This kind of attention can be dangerous." Jimmel nodded, but his resolve was firm. He wasn't going to let this moment pass. His father deserved justice, and he would do whatever it took to get it. The storm was building. Across the city, people took sides, arguments flared, and tensions rose. But at the heart of it all lay a man who had given his life to serve, now fighting a silent battle in a hospital bed. This wasn't just about Robert King anymore. It was about a broken system, a legacy of sacrifice, and a family determined to reclaim their voice. And for Jimmel, it was just the beginning. The awakening. The tension inside the hospital was as thick as fog, but the fire outside burned hotter. The protests had grown overnight, and the once quiet street outside the hospital now buzzed with chants, camera crews, and signs demanding justice for Robert King. Jimmel sat slumped in one of the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, scrolling through endless notifications on his phone. Every news outlet had picked up the story, and his father's name was now a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. Jimmel rubbed his temples, exhaustion gnawing at him. His mother, Evelyn, sat beside him, clutching a lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched. Her eyes were red and weary, a mix of sleeplessness and worry. "They're calling him a hero," she said softly, breaking the silence. Jimmel looked up. "He is a hero. Always has been. It's just sad it took something like this for the world to see it." Evelyn reached out, placing her hand over Jimmel's. "Your father would be proud of how you're standing up for him. For what's right." Jimmel wanted to believe that, but in the quiet moments, doubt crept in. Was he doing enough? Could he ever truly make things right for his father? He glanced at the ICU doors, wishing more than anything that Robert would walk through them, healthy and whole, and tell him what to do next. The sound of hurried footsteps snapped him from his thoughts. Colonel Anthony Myers appeared, his presence commanding as always. This time, he wasn't alone. Two men in suits flanked him, their expressions unreadable. "Jamal," Myers said, nodding as he approached. "Can we talk?" Jamal stood, his chest tightening. "What's going on?" Myers glanced at Evelyn, who straightened in her seat but said nothing. He gestured for Jamal to follow him to a quiet corner of the waiting room. "First, I want you to know your father is stable," Myers began, his voice low but steady. "But we're not here just to talk about his condition." "Then what?" Jamal asked, his voice tense. "What aren't you telling me?" Myers exchanged a glance with one of the suited men, who nodded subtly. "Your father's service record isn't just about medals and missions, Jamal. He's protected more than you can imagine. Lives, entire communities, even this country itself. But that kind of legacy doesn't come without enemies." Jamal's brow furrowed. "Enemies? What are you talking about?" Myers leaned closer. "Your father's missions, some of them were classified. He's crossed paths with powerful people who don't like what he stands for, people who want to see him silenced." Jamal felt his stomach drop. "Are you saying this wasn't just a random act of violence? That this cop knew who my dad was?" Myers hesitated, his expression unreadable. "We don't know yet, but we have reason to believe Officer Price may have been influenced by forces beyond what you've seen on the surface." Jamal's jaw tightened. "You think someone wanted this to happen?" "It's possible," Myers admitted. "But for now, our focus is making sure your father gets the justice he deserves, and that the world knows who he really is." Across town, Bradley Price sat in the sterile office of Internal Affairs, his palms sweaty as he stared at the empty chair across from him. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights only heightened the tension in the room. The waiting was unbearable, each passing second pulling him further into the quicksand of his mistakes. Finally, the door opened, and two investigators entered. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Andrea Larkin, placed a thick file on the table and sat across from him. "Officer Price," she began, her voice clipped. "We're here to conduct a preliminary interview regarding the incident involving Mr. Robert King." Bradley nodded stiffly, his throat dry. "I understand." Andrea opened the file and flipped through several pages. "Before we proceed, I want to remind you that this is being recorded. Do you understand your rights as outlined earlier?" "Yes," Bradley replied, his voice barely audible. "Good." Andrea leaned forward, her piercing gaze locking onto him. "Let's start with your actions that day. What led you to confront Mr. King and those two young men?" Bradley hesitated. He had rehearsed his response in his head, but under the weight of her scrutiny, the words felt hollow. "The two young men looked suspicious," he began, his voice faltering. "I was conducting a routine check." "Suspicious?" Andrea repeated, raising an eyebrow. "In what way?" "They had an unmarked bottle in one of their bags," Bradley said. "I thought it might be drugs." "And when Mr. King intervened," Andrea prompted. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. He was interfering. I told him to step back." Andrea's eyes narrowed. "So, you punched him?" Bradley's face flushed. "It wasn't like that." It's exactly like that." Andrea interrupted, her tone icy. "We've all seen the video, Officer Price. Your actions weren't just excessive, they were reckless and unjustifiable." Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He knew she was right. No amount of excuses could erase what he had done. Andrea closed the file with a sharp snap. "This isn't going away, Officer Price. The public is demanding accountability, and frankly, they're right to do so. You're suspended without pay effective immediately. Further actions will depend on the outcome of this investigation." As Andrea and her colleague left the room, Bradley slumped in his chair, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. For the first time, he realized there was no way out of this, not unscathed. The call for justice, Back at the hospital, Jamal stood before the growing crowd of protesters outside the entrance. His heart pounded as he gripped the microphone in his hand. He had never been one for public speaking, but this was different. This was for his father. "My name is Jamal King," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "You've seen the video. You know what happened. But what you might not know is who my father is." The crowd quieted, their attention locked on him. "My father, Robert King, dedicated his life to protecting this country," Jamal continued. "He served with honor and courage, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And yet, when he came home, the country he fought for failed him." Chants of "Justice for King" erupted from the crowd, but Jamal held up a hand, and they quieted. "This isn't just about my father," he said, his voice growing stronger. "This is about every person who has been treated like their life doesn't matter. This is about demanding accountability, not just for him, but for all of us." The crowd roared in agreement, their signs waving in unison. As Jamal stepped back, Evelyn approached him, tears streaming down her face. "Your father would be so proud of you," she whispered. Jamal nodded, his resolve hardening. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. Unseen battles. The night air was thick with tension as Jamal King sat in his father's hospital room, staring at the rhythmic rise and fall of Robert's chest. Machines beat softly, each sound a cruel reminder of the fragility of life. The protests outside had grown louder, spilling into the national consciousness. But inside these walls, everything felt still. Too still. Jamal clenched his fists as memories of his father flooded his mind. Robert King wasn't just his dad. He was a mentor, a protector, and a man who had taught him the meaning of integrity. It was impossible to reconcile the image of the towering man who had once carried him on his shoulders with the fragile figure lying before him. "Dad," Jamal whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this without you." Evelyn entered quietly, carrying a tray of food Jamal had ignored earlier. She placed it on the bedside table and sat down, her eyes scanning her son's face. "You need to eat, Jamal," she said gently. "I can't," he replied, not looking at her. "Not until I know he's going to wake up." Evelyn sighed, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder. "Your father is the strongest man I've ever known. If anyone can survive this, it's him." Jamal nodded but said nothing. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from the suffocating silence. It was a message from Derek, his best friend and now unofficial publicist. "Derek, CNN wants a statement. They're running another piece on your dad tonight. Call me." Jamal exhaled sharply. The world wanted answers, but all he had were questions. Why did this happen? Why his father? And why hadn't the system done more to prevent it? Across town, Officer Bradley Price paced the confines of his apartment, the dim light casting long shadows across the cluttered room. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Robert King's body crumpling to the ground, the blood pooling on the pavement, and the unblinking stares of the crowd. His phone buzzed again, another notification he didn't want to see. The video of the incident had reached over 10 million views, and the public outrage showed no signs of slowing. News anchors dissected his actions with brutal precision. Legal experts debated potential charges, and social media burned with calls for his arrest. But it wasn't just the public's judgment that haunted him. It was the messages, the anonymous texts that had been coming for days. Unknown. Do you know who he is yet? You should. Unknown. The clock is ticking. Bradley. Do the right thing. He had tried to brush them off as internet trolls, but something about their tone felt deeper, personal. He didn't know who was behind them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more about Robert King and Bradley's own actions than they let on. The latest text sent a chill down his spine. Unknown. You don't just owe Robert King. You owe everyone he ever saved. Bradley dropped his phone onto the couch, his hands trembling. The walls of his apartment felt closer than ever, pressing in on him with each passing second. He knew he couldn't hide forever. The colonel's warning. Colonel Anthony Myers leaned against the wall of the hospital hallway, his sharp gaze fixed on Jamal. The young man looked exhausted but resolute, a mirror of his father's unyielding spirit. "Jamal," Myers said, stepping closer, "I need to talk to you. Privately." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but nodded, stepping back into Robert's room. Jamal followed Myers down the hallway, where the colonel's demeanor shifted to something darker, more urgent. "What's going on?" Jamal asked, his nerves on edge. Myers glanced around before speaking. "There's more to this than you know." "What do you mean?" "Your father didn't just serve this country," Myers said, his voice low. "He protected it. He's part of a legacy most people can't even comprehend. The missions he led, the lives he saved, they weren't just heroic. They were pivotal. Some of them are classified to this day." Jamal frowned. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the attention this case is getting isn't just about justice," Myers continued. "It's waking up ghosts. People who have a vested interest in keeping your father's past buried." Jamal's chest tightened. "Are you saying someone wants to stop us? To cover this up?" Myers nodded grimly. "It's possible. The more you push, the more dangerous this fight becomes. I need you to be prepared." Jamal crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I don't care who they are. I'm not stopping. My father deserves better than this." Myers gave him a small, approving nod. "Good, but don't do this alone. There are people who owe your father their lives. People who will stand with you." Jamal felt a flicker of hope. "Like who?" Myers smirked. "You'll find out soon enough." The ripple effect. That evening, Jamal stood on the steps of City Hall, facing a sea of protesters and flashing cameras. Derek stood at his side, holding up his phone to live-stream the moment. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jamal took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He hadn't planned to speak, but the energy of the crowd pulled him forward. He stepped up to the microphone, the chants fading into silence as the crowd waited. "My father, Robert King, isn't just a victim," Jamal began, his voice strong. "He's a hero, a man who spent his life protecting others, fighting for justice, and standing up for what's right. And now, it's our turn to stand up for him." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Jamal raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about one man," he continued. "This is about every person who has been silenced, every life that has been treated like it doesn't matter. We're here to say, no more." The crowd roared, their voices echoing through the night. "Justice for Robert King," someone shouted, and the chant quickly spread, filling the air with a unified cry. "A fateful decision." In the quiet of his apartment, Bradley Price stared at his phone, the latest text message burning into his mind. Unknown. Confession is the first step toward redemption. For hours, he had wrestled with his guilt, his fear, and his pride. But now, as the weight of the world pressed down on him, he knew there was no escaping what he had done. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had avoided for days. When the line clicked, a voice on the other end greeted him coldly. "This is Internal Affairs. How can we help you?" Bradley took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "I need to make a statement." The world was watching, the storm growing stronger with each passing moment. And as the battle for justice raged on, the stakes became clearer. This wasn't just about Robert King. It was about a nation reckoning with its past, its present, and the kind of future it wanted to build. Truths revealed. The city was a simmering cauldron, the tension rising as the world tuned in to the unfolding story of Robert King. Outside the hospital, the crowd had doubled overnight, spilling into adjacent streets and drawing the attention of global news networks. Chants of "Justice for King" echoed through the air, a relentless cry for accountability. Jamal King stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart heavy, but his resolve unshaken. The world might have been watching now, but for Jamal, this wasn't a movement. It was his life. It was his father. And he wouldn't rest until the man responsible for this injustice faced the full weight of his actions. Derek approached, his phone in hand. "Jamal, you've got to see this." Jamal frowned, taking the phone. On the screen was a video, a recording of Officer Bradley Price speaking at a hastily arranged press conference earlier that morning. He looked pale, disheveled, and visibly shaken. "First, I want to apologize," Bradley said, his voice trembling. "To Mr. Robert King, to his family, and to everyone affected by my actions. What I did was wrong. It was reckless. I let my anger and prejudice control me, and for that, I take full responsibility." Jamal's jaw tightened as he listened. The words sounded rehearsed, hollow, as though they were spoken more out of fear than genuine remorse. "I've agreed to cooperate fully with internal affairs and any legal proceedings," Bradley continued. "I know an apology can't undo the harm I've caused, but I hope it's a step toward making things right." The video ended, and Derek looked at Jamal expectantly. "What do you think?" Jamal handed the phone back, his expression unreadable. "I think he's scared. Scared of what'll happen if he doesn't try to save himself." "Yeah," Derek said, scratching the back of his head. "But it's something, right? It's a start." Jamal shook his head. A start would have been him stopping himself before he threw that punch. This is just damage control." The meeting. Inside the hospital, Colonel Anthony Myers paced the hallway outside Robert King's room. Evelyn stood nearby, watching him with a mix of curiosity and unease. Jamal entered, his expression tense as he joined them. "What's going on?" Jamal asked. Myers stopped pacing and turned to face him. "We've made contact with some of your father's old team, people who owe him their lives. They're ready to support you, publicly if needed." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Why now?" "Because this isn't just about justice anymore," Myers said. "It's about legacy. Your father's story is a symbol, and symbols have power. If we let this moment pass, it sends a message that heroes can be discarded, that their sacrifices mean nothing." Jamal nodded slowly. "So, what do we do?" Myers smiled grimly. "We fight. Not just in the streets, but in the court of public opinion. We make it impossible for them to ignore us." As they spoke, a nurse emerged from Robert's room. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle. "There's been some movement." Jamal's heart leaped. "What do you mean?" "Your father's shown some signs of responsiveness," the nurse explained. "It's still early, but it's a good sign." Evelyn covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Jamal felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. He rushed into the room, where Robert lay, his eyelids fluttering slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Dad," Jamal whispered, gripping his father's hand. "We're here. We're not going anywhere." Behind the scenes, across the city, Bradley Price sat in a small interrogation room at the precinct, his nerves frayed as the weight of the past week poured down on him. Internal affairs had been relentless, their questions cutting deeper with each session. "You say you didn't know who Robert King was," Investigator Andrea Larkin said, her voice cold. "But you knew enough to dismiss him. Why is that?" Bradley's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't think. I just reacted." "Reacted to what?" Andrea pressed. "His race, his stance, the fact that he stood up to you." Bradley looked away, shame and anger twisting inside him. "I don't know. Maybe all of it." Andrea leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Let me tell you what I think, Officer Price. I think you saw a man who challenged your authority, and instead of de-escalating, you escalated. You turned a situation that didn't need to exist into a national tragedy." Bradley swallowed hard. He had no defense. Deep down, he knew she was right. The press conference. The following day, Jamal stood in front of a sea of cameras outside City Hall, flanked by Colonel Myers, Evelyn, and a handful of his father's former comrades. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he stood tall, his father's strength echoing in his stance. "My father is awake," Jamal began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "And while we're grateful for his progress, this fight isn't over. My father shouldn't be lying in a hospital bed. He shouldn't have been attacked for standing up for what's right." The crowd murmured, their energy palpable. "This isn't just about Robert King," Jamal continued. "This is about every person who has been silenced, every hero who has been ignored, and every life that has been devalued. We're here to say enough is enough." Colonel Myers stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs. "Robert King is a symbol of everything this country should aspire to be: courageous, selfless, and committed to justice. What happened to him is a stain on this nation's conscience, and we won't rest until that stain is removed." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of "Justice for King" growing louder and more unified. A glimmer of hope. That evening, Jamal sat by his father's bedside, the noise of the world fading away as he focused on the quiet beeping of the machines. Robert's eyes fluttered open briefly, and his lips moved, though no sound came out. "Dad," Jamal said, leaning closer. "It's me, Jamal." Robert's lips parted, his voice barely audible. "You fought. Good." Jamal's chest tightened, tears streaming down his face. "We're still fighting, Dad. We're not giving up." Robert's fingers twitched, and for the first time, Jamal felt the strength of his father's grip. The reckoning. Across town, Bradley Price stared at his reflection in the mirror of his apartment. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. The texts from the unknown sender hadn't stopped, each one a haunting reminder of the truth he couldn't escape. "Unknown. Your apology isn't enough. Justice will be served." Bradley's phone buzzed again, this time with a call. He hesitated before answering. "This is Officer Price," he said, his voice hollow. A deep voice on the other end responded. "Your time is up. Turn yourself in, or we'll make sure the world knows everything." Bradley's breath caught. He knew he had no choice. The reckoning he had feared was here. The reckoning and the legacy. The morning was thick with anticipation, the kind of energy that settled into the bones and refused to let go. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of protesters had swelled to thousands. Signs reading "Justice for King" and "No More Excuses" were held high as chants echoed off the city's towering buildings. News vans lined the streets, their reporters buzzing with the kind of urgency that came with covering history in the making. Jamal King stood at the center of it all, his mother Evelyn by his side, and Colonel Anthony Myers flanking him. They were joined by several of Robert King's former military comrades, their uniforms crisp and their faces resolute. Today wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about setting a precedent, about saying loudly and clearly that the actions of men like Officer Bradley Price would no longer go unchecked. Jamal looked toward the courthouse steps, where reporters and cameras waited for him. His father's words echoed in his mind, spoken years earlier during one of their long talks about life and values. "Courage isn't just about facing danger," Robert had said. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when the whole world seems against you." Jamal took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and began walking toward the microphones. The crowd parted for him, their chants softening as they waited to hear him speak. The confession. Inside the courthouse, Bradley Price sat in a sterile conference room, flanked by his lawyer and two internal affairs officers. His appearance was a stark contrast to the confident officer he had once been. His uniform was gone, replaced by a cheap suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. Dark circles underlined his bloodshot eyes, and his hands trembled as he fidgeted with a pen. The lead internal affairs officer, Andrea Larkin, leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. "Officer Price, are you ready to give your statement?" Bradley nodded, his throat dry. He had spent the past week drowning in guilt, each day bringing new waves of shame and regret. The texts from the unknown sender had only added to the weight, pushing him toward the inevitable. I'm ready," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Andrea said, clicking a recorder on the table. "Let's begin." Bradley swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he began to speak. "What I did to Robert King was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I saw a man who challenged my authority, and instead of handling the situation with professionalism, I let my emotions take over. I attacked him, and I hurt him." Andrea didn't interrupt, her gaze steady. "I didn't know who he was at the time," Bradley continued, his voice cracking. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is that I let my biases, my anger, and my insecurity guide my actions. I failed, both as an officer and as a human being." Andrea leaned back, her expression unreadable. "And do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Bradley nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I do. I'm ready to face whatever comes next." Andrea clicked off the recorder and stood. "This will be forwarded to the district attorney's office. You'll be formally charged within the week." As the officers left the room, Bradley sank back into his chair, the weight of his confession settling over him. For the first time in days, he felt a sliver of relief. He had told the truth. Now he had to face it. The courtroom. The courthouse was packed, the tension palpable as Bradley Price was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. He kept his head down, avoiding the glares and whispers that followed him. Jamal, Evelyn, and a group of Robert's military comrades sat in the front row, their presence a silent testament to their unity and strength. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The formalities began, with the charges against Bradley being read aloud. Assault, misconduct, violation of civil rights. Each word landed like a hammer, reverberating through the courtroom. When the judge asked how Bradley pleaded, he stood shakily and uttered 2 words. "Guilty, Your Honor." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs that the judge quickly silenced. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding. It wasn't the end, but it was a step. The hospital awakens. That evening, back at the hospital, Jamal sat by his father's bedside, the events of the day swirling in his mind. The courtroom, the confession, the crowd, it had all felt surreal. But none of it compared to the moment when Robert's hand twitched again. "Dad," Jamal whispered, leaning closer. Robert's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused but alive. Jamal's breath caught, tears streaming down his face. "You're awake." Evelyn rushed in, covering her mouth as she saw Robert's eyes open. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, thank God." Robert's lips moved, his voice hoarse. "What happened?" Jamal swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he explained. "You stood up for those boys, Dad. You got hurt, but you're going to be okay. We got this. I got this." Robert's gaze sharpened slightly, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "I knew you would." The legacy lives on. In the weeks that followed, the story of Robert King became a symbol of change. The protests continued, not just for him, but for the countless others who had suffered similar injustices. Laws were proposed, policies reviewed, and training programs implemented in police departments across the country. The fight was far from over, but progress was undeniable. Jamal became a prominent voice in the movement, speaking at rallies, on news programs, and even at congressional hearings. He shared his father's story, not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to courage and resilience. As for Robert, his recovery was slow but steady. Each day brought small victories, words spoken, hands lifted, steps taken. And through it all, he remained the man he had always been, strong, humble, and unwavering in his belief that justice was worth fighting for. One evening, as Jamal sat with his father on the hospital balcony, watching the sunset, Robert turned to him. "You've done more than I could have ever imagined, Jamal," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You've made me proud." Jamal smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "I learned from the best. Robert chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "The fight's not over." "I know," Jamal said, "but we'll keep going. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, father and son sat in silence, their bond stronger than ever. The fight for justice was far from over, but they faced it with hope, knowing they were part of something bigger than themselves, a legacy of courage, resilience, and change. The news cycle shifted into overdrive as updates on Robert King's recovery and Bradley Price's impending trial dominated headlines. Public interest only grew as more details of Robert's service emerged, stories of missions that had saved lives, acts of bravery that had gone unnoticed outside military circles, and a quiet humility that defined his character. Jamal and Evelyn balanced their time between the hospital and the movement, while Colonel Anthony Myers coordinated efforts with Robert's former comrades to amplify his legacy. The world wasn't just listening anymore, it was demanding change. The trial. Weeks later, the courthouse was packed again for the trial of Bradley Price. This time, Robert King was present, sitting in a wheelchair but alert and resolute. The sight of him stirred a wave of emotion in the courtroom, from gasps of recognition to murmurs of respect. It was a powerful reminder that this wasn't just about one man. It was about the countless others who had been silenced before they could tell their stories. Jamal sat beside his father, his hand resting protectively on Robert's shoulder. Evelyn was next to him, her expression calm but determined. Colonel Myers and a group of Robert's comrades filled the row behind them, their presence a silent but powerful statement of solidarity. The prosecution laid out a damning case, presenting the video of the assault, eyewitness testimonies, and evidence of Bradley's history of aggressive behavior on the job. The defense attempted to argue that Bradley had acted out of stress and poor judgment, but the weight of public outcry and the clear evidence left little room for sympathy. When it was Jamal's turn to testify, he spoke with a clarity and conviction that silenced the courtroom. "My father taught me that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. That day, he wasn't just standing up for those boys. He was standing up for all of us, for the idea that we all deserve respect, no matter who we are or where we come from. He glanced at Bradley, whose head was bowed, his expression unreadable. What happened to my father wasn't just an act of violence. It was a betrayal of the very values we should all hold dear. And that betrayal has to be accounted for. The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Cheers, tears, and a sense of vindication that had been a long time coming. Bradley Price stood as the judge read his sentence. 10 years in prison, with additional time for violations of civil rights. As he was led away in handcuffs, Bradley glanced back at Robert King. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, Bradley seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had done. Robert held his gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. A new chapter. In the weeks following the trial, Jamal became a national figure, a leader in the movement for police reform and accountability. He worked tirelessly to push for legislation that would address systemic issues, inspired by the strength and resilience his father had shown throughout his life. Robert's recovery continued, and though he still had a long road ahead, he embraced each day with the same courage that had defined him for decades. His story became a symbol of hope and change, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there was always the possibility for progress. One evening, Jamal and Robert sat together on the porch of their home, the cool breeze carrying the sounds of distant laughter and life continuing. "You've done more than I could have imagined," Robert said, his voice strong despite the lingering fatigue. "You've turned this into something bigger than any of us." Jamal smiled, looking out at the setting sun. "I just wanted people to see you for who you are, Dad. To see what I've always known." Robert reached out, gripping his son's hand. "You've given me something even better, Jamal. You've given me hope." The legacy lives on. As the months turned into years, the story of Robert King remained a touchstone for a nation grappling with its flaws. Laws were passed, training programs implemented, and conversations about justice and accountability became louder, more urgent, and impossible to ignore. For Jamal, the fight never ended, but neither did the hope. He carried his father's lessons with him into every room, every meeting, every speech, knowing that the legacy of courage and resilience Robert had built was now a shared mission. And for Robert, each new day was a gift, a chance to live the values he had always believed in, to see the change he had fought for, and to stand proudly as a father who had inspired not just his son, but an entire generation. Justice had been served, but the work was far from over. And in the hearts of all who had followed their story, Robert and Jamal King's fight for a better world became a reminder that true courage was not in the absence of fear, but in the refusal to be defeated by it.